I'm sure many of us have heard a concept. And actually, I'll talk about concepts for a second. Whatever is put forward by myself, or by anyone for that matter, whether it's verbal form or written form, is a concept. A concept is an opinion, a description, a theory, and it's not the truth. It's a description of something which by default has to be limited, is describing it in a way that is relative to a particular topic, let's say. So it can't be the thing itself. So we can have a concept of gravity or a theory of gravity, and that concept can accurately describe something, but it isn't the thing itself. So gravity exists independent of the concept of gravity. And when I describe gravity, or if I have a concept of gravity, it isn't really capturing gravity, it's just describing it. And so the concepts are pointers. They're concepts that are useful for this particular question of peace of mind. And they describe life in a particular way, with the hope that the concept allows us to check it out for ourselves. Investigate what the concept is saying and see if it makes sense. See if you think the concept is a fair description. And if you see what the concept is describing and it's a fair description, then you can hold the concept as a description and know that it is describing something that is independent of the concept. So, an example. Happiness for the human being is available on a continuous, unbroken basis in the form of peace of mind. So that's a concept. Peace of mind is not the gaining of something, but that which is there when suffering falls away. Another concept. Suffering, in practical terms, arises in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation. Another concept. Blame is an attitude towards the actions that happen through the other, that interpret the other as being a separate, independent doer, who has delivered the pain which is seen to be an attack on oneself. And then as a result we say, you hurt me, I hate you. Blame. That's a concept. See, they're all descriptions. So virtually everything I say can be broken down into sub-concepts. So the 2 hours of speaking can be broken down into many sub-concepts. That is a concept. If I describe, a concept is a description. That is a concept about concepts. And they are concepts that really are there simply for you to check out what the concept is pointing at for yourself. That's a very significant part of the process. If we just believe the concepts and don't investigate them for ourselves, then the understanding won't go sufficiently deep. It will just remain as a belief, and it won't have an authentic power to cut off suffering. So I was going to start off, before I realized we could talk about concept, asking or suggesting that many of us have heard of the concept that what we are is peace. What we are is presence.
That's understood, but where's then where does desire come into it? The natural human desires of, or loneliness, for example. That's not a desire, but things like that. Are they
So, desire in the sense where we feel we need something in order to, where we desire something with a craving, or loneliness or boredom, those particular feelings fit into the category of suffering. There are different forms of suffering. And they essentially are a result of us feeling or being disconnected from the essence of the human being, the core of who we are. So when the concept says what we are is peace, we don't have to do peacefulness. We are peace. We are presence. We are love. The word what we are can change depending on the teaching, but essentially what it's saying is our very nature is what we are seeking. And so when we're experiencing the absence of peace, so in context of this teaching, what it would be, we are peace. In another teaching, they might say we are love. But they're really the love and peace, when we look at what those words really mean in the context of spiritual teachings. When a teaching talks about love, it really talks about an acceptance and inclusivity rather than the human emotion of love. It's talking about a oneness, inclusivity. Seeing everything as valid, which is very much in line with peace of mind, the absence of a resistance to this should or shouldn't be. So if the suffering is arising in its different forms, it means that there has been a forgetting or a disconnection with that essence of ourself that is peace, because peace is peace, which means the absence of suffering. So if the suffering is there, then what we are has been overlooked.
Okay, I haven't framed the question very well. What it is for most of my life, I've looked for fulfillment in drugs, say, and other people have looked for it in sex, and that's a disconnection or a misunderstanding, yeah? So how to fix that?
So the seeking for fulfillment in external objects or in other people, in outcomes, is a consequence of a disconnection to oneself, a consequence of a certain identity having formed, and that identity is the opposite of peace. The identity that gets formed is an identity that feels uncomfortable, and so then there's this search for a solution to the uncomfortableness. And the best that we know is pleasure instead of pain. And in some cases we've found temporary solutions where we can be numbed or can be distracted, and the suffering sort of gets less intense or covered up for a while. So that's become the strategy. And it isn't going to fix the problem that we can see for ourselves. You can pursue that strategy for many years, and still it doesn't deliver an ongoing solution. So at some point you can say, I've sought happiness in the form of addiction or pleasure, and it's not to be found there. So that is a insight that you can have for yourself based on your own experience, and it's very important. For as long as the insight isn't really clear, we'll keep thinking that, okay, in the next attempt, I might find it there. So after 10 years or 5 years or whatever of doing that, at some point you say, well, haven't I done it enough times to be able to draw the conclusion that this isn't where ongoing happiness is to be found? And then the teachings tell us, no, it's not. That is part of the error, to seek fulfillment in circumstance. Actually, the fulfillment that is available to the human being is the fulfillment of the absence of suffering. The fulfillment that we can call peace of mind. And so your question, how do I do this? Understandable question, but once again, you could see it's the doer kicking in and saying, hey, I'd like to control life, can you tell me how? And so one answer is we can't do it. It happens when it's destined to happen. And yet, Ramesh used to say, no reason to be pessimistic, because as we can see, life is taking us down a path which is a path of it happening, as opposed to many other people in the world that aren't being, ushered down a path where the habits, the beliefs are likely to be interfered with. So we're on that path. So even though we can't make it happen, that's not bad news, because life is already making it happen. And so to recognize that can be, so I can relax. The doer can relax because it thinks it needs to make it happen, because it thinks that if I don't make it happen, it's not going to happen. And yet, from your own experience, you can see, actually, it's already happening. And it's not my doing, because that concept makes sense. So I can relax and not feel frustrated that I'm not the doer. It's frustrating to hear we're not the doer when things aren't heading in the right direction. So to hear you're not in control of the train can be frustrating. Conceptually, it's like, well, this is not good news, until you realize that the train has been heading in the direction you want to go for the last, 3 hours that you've been on it, and that you don't need to be in control of the train.
Okay, so yes, I know this, and yes, I walked into that. How do I do it? But that's still elements of doership that are within me. But what is it fundamentally that causes this problem? Does it make any difference?
What causes the problem? Which problem?
Well, to go seeking so intently in certain things. for fulfillment.
Well, the seeking is a result of an uncomfortableness. If the uncomfortableness wasn't there, we wouldn't seek. So, in a way, the seeking, even though seeking at some points is in itself more doership, that then just adds to the suffering, which can deliver an insight of itself, where we realize, oh, I'm the one trying to do non-doership, and that is just making things more frustrating. And if that trying to do non-doership, trying to do non-attachment to outcomes, is seen as an error, then the seeking tends to refine itself such that that particular attitude in the seeking then becomes less. So we start off with doership in our seeking that manifests as an uncomfortableness and a frustration, and we end up finding that in time our seeking becomes much less filled with doership and much more a happening that doesn't include the doership in it, which you've said is what happens from time to time, and then at other times the suffering comes back in, and then you find yourself asking a lot of questions, which at other times, when the seeking is happening effortlessly, you don't have any questions like this to ask, because so you can see that the question often comes out of an uncomfortableness in a particular moment, or a sense, oh, I'm lost, which just means that suffering is arising in that moment, and what it does is it drives the seeking.
Okay, thanks, Roger.
I'm just curious if you could say a little more about this uncomfortableness. Does it have any specificness to it? Like, is the uncomfortableness that I feel more or less the same uncomfortableness that Sean feels and you feel? I don't know if you feel it anymore, but is there some specificness to this uncomfortableness, or could you describe it a little more in detail?
It's a bit hard when you ask me to describe uncomfortableness in more detail, because that's the word I usually use to describe suffering. So if someone says, is my suffering the same as Sean's suffering? I'd say yes, in essence it is, because in essence, when you feel into it, it's an uncomfortableness with oneself, an uncomfortableness with the other. And so in describing it as an uncomfortableness, hopefully that pointer will serve as an encouragement for someone to ask, is suffering an uncomfortableness with oneself, with myself, with the other? And even an uncomfortableness with the other really is an uncomfortableness with oneself. That's the concept. So then, hopefully that directs our attention towards the uncomfortableness of suffering. And what I found is that that's a great word. Uncomfortableness is a great word to describe the theme, the thread that is at the base of all the different forms of suffering: guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. So if you were then to ask me, so what does this uncomfortableness feel like? Then I have to find a new word to point at that. So it's better if we take a step back and go, well, is my suffering the same? And then I'll say, yes, it's basically an uncomfortableness with oneself. And then the best way for you to know what I really mean by that, and I'm sure you've got some experience of being aware of that, is to feel the suffering. Really then, feel it and say, what is this? And so it's also very important to have some categorization of the different forms of suffering: guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation, and they all have their own flavor to them. So we feel the suffering when it's there, and we say, okay, this is anxiety, this is blame, this is shame or guilt. So under guilt, there's a lot of subsets of guilt: lack of self-worth, embarrassment, shame, depression, all of which are forms of I am guilty of not being good enough. I didn't perform well enough. And so the more familiar we become with the different forms of suffering, and also I think that these 5 headings, guilt, which have underneath them maybe some subsets of them, but generally speaking, the 5 different sorts: guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation. So the first 3, guilt, blame, and pride, based on seeing oneself as the doer, seeing the other as the doer. So I carry out some actions, and the outcome is not great. I end up getting feedback from a friend that they're not happy with me because I went out with this girl, or whatever the situation happens to be. And then I say, well, that's not a good outcome, painful outcome, and feel like I wasn't good enough because I made the wrong decision as the doer. So that's guilt. Blame, same principle, seeing that, that person shouldn't have done such and such. And pride is looking at those actions that happen through me that deliver a good outcome, and then we say, oh, look what I, as the doer, have achieved. So guilt, blame, and pride, they're different flavors based on the principle of personal doership. If you take away the belief in personal doership, then the guilt doesn't have, the linchpin of guilt is personal doership. If you take that away and we see, well, I couldn't have acted differently, then you can't feel guilty. You can discern that I couldn't have acted differently and the outcome was not a good outcome. So this seeing I'm not the doer doesn't mean that we stop being able to discern good outcomes from bad outcomes. But it means that once I've seen that wasn't a good outcome, the deeper uncomfortableness of shame can't arise. And the same, if we take away this linchpin of personal doership, the deeper expression of blame can't arise. And then worry and expectation, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes are psychological movements of suffering based on the deeply ingrained belief that I need life to turn out a particular way. And so we have expectations about how life should turn out, where we're heavily focused on things turning out in the future, which disturbs us really being present and enjoying life here and now, because we're so focused on a strategy to make life a certain way in 5 years' time. And that strategy can be, we wake up in the morning and we're focused on how to make something happen in 5 years, and we can spend the whole day with this expectation. We can have expectations about how our friends act and how our family act and how our neighbors act. And when they don't act that way, we find this resistance, not only blaming them, but blaming them because we feel like their actions which are essentially outcomes, either pleasure or pain, are an attack on who I am. So we have expectation and attachment to outcome, which is the resistance when the outcome is painful. And there is worry and anxiety, which is the thinking mind saying, well, I need life to, be pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And I have this sense that something has already gone wrong and I just don't know about it, or something is about to go wrong, and that's anxiety. And that they're all based on this idea, if life isn't pleasure, 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 that is an attack on who I am. So that's us coming to understand the 5 different forms of suffering, and as we become more and more familiar with them, then we can start to feel the common thread in all the different forms. And the common thread, as I would describe it, is an uncomfortableness with oneself. So if you can feel that through investigation, my experience was to say, wow, that's a really great word to coin or to describe that feeling of what suffering is.
So the reason that I ask was because when I investigated, it often happens after I've been suffering, so I blame somebody or I feel guilt or whatever, and then afterwards I find out, oh, that was suffering. Clearly, blah, blah, blah. But then this feeling of uncomfortableness have made it possible to realize it while it's going on. I think the concept uncomfortableness makes it easier to realize it while it's going on instead of realizing it afterwards. And my experience is that just knowing it, just realizing it, takes the energy out of it in a great amount. Mm-hmm. So the question was to see if there's some kind of way to realize it even earlier on in the process, because I realized that sometimes let's say anger, for example. After I dived into these teachings, I've just given myself permission to be angry when I'm angry. Mm-hmm. But then sometimes I realize afterwards, oh shit, this was not anger. Mm-hmm. This was all kind of suffering going on. And because there's so much energy in anger, let's say, for example, it's very nice, or it's very, I don't know the English word, hensigtsmæssigt. Do you know the word? Hmm? Sorry? Helpful, yeah, maybe. Yeah, it's very helpful, let's say, to realize it early on in the process, because then, yeah, the damage get less, and so that was why I asked the question, because maybe there's some kind of feeling into it that is like early on in the process.
So one thing is when we hear the concept that you have biological anger, which is different to suffering. Just to touch on this comment, it can be very easy for us then to start labeling all the suffering as just biological anger. And that then becomes a convenient way of us, incorrectly labeling suffering, which means we don't look at it as suffering. So that can be a pitfall, because it's very important to know the difference between anger and blame. That's why the concept is there that says anger is not necessarily suffering. Anger in its pure form is just a painful biological reaction. And the reason for that is that we need to be able to stop judging anger and understand it is an inevitable biological reaction. That is not anyone's doing, it's part of our biology. The same with sadness. However, when attachment to outcomes and doership is there, anger and sadness is very likely to be accompanied by guilt, blame, expectation. And so we need to have that information, that anger and sadness are biological reactions and not blame, but at the same time not use that to overlook the suffering part that often arises with those biological reactions. If we do overlook it, then we won't be able to feel what the suffering feels like, because we're saying, no, that's just a biological reaction. In my case, so I speak from my experience, there was a point when I felt I was hypersensitive to suffering, as in my internal radar had become very finely tuned as to know what suffering felt like, and as soon as it arose, there was that's suffering. Why that's important is, as soon as we know that it's suffering, we know that it's a mistaken story, which not to blame ourselves for it, but to know that the story that's going on, the blame, it feels like there's a lot of justification in the blame. There's a lot of reason why what we're saying. So then we talk to our friend, can you believe what this person did? And we spend 20 minutes explaining all the details, and we're convinced when we're explaining it how right we are and how justified we are at blaming the person and how victimized we are. That's part of the nature of suffering, is it convinces us of the truth of the story. The fact is that suffering is based on a misunderstanding, a false idea of ourself, and therefore everything that stems on top of the false idea is a falsity. So as soon as we have locked these sort of rules in place for ourselves, that suffering is based on a misunderstanding of who we are, and the story is an error, it never is seeing life from a place of wisdom. Once we've locked those away as givens, as soon as our radar has picked up this is suffering, then there is a voice of reason that can start accompanying the suffering. The voice of reason is the voice that says to ourselves, be careful what you do with this, because it's not an accurate way of seeing things, and the more you let that feeling run loose, the more it's disturbing your present moment, and you'll find from experience that the consequences of blaming the person come back, and you have to deal with those consequences. You end up realizing maybe that you were out of line, that you created a big story out of nothing, you apologize, and so the quicker that we can register suffering as suffering, the better it is. Now that doesn't mean that we are going to be able to cut it off. It might not get cut off. But part of the cutting off is us understanding suffering as suffering. Understanding that it isn't based on wisdom. That's so. And that requires us to be able to tell the difference between suffering and other arisings in the body. So your question essentially is, how do I, what are the signs of suffering? And I don't really know how to explain it more other than, breaking the suffering down into fairly specific forms, including the description that is an uncomfortableness with oneself. And after a while, as soon as you have one of these stories that makes you feel a certain way towards the other, makes you feel a certain way towards yourself, makes you feel a certain way towards the present moment or towards God, straight away we should be able to pick it up. I've been seeing this as suffering for the last 5 years. And so as soon as I start feeling a certain way towards my sister, something inside of us should go, that's suffering. I know that is suffering. As soon as I start feeling a certain way towards my neighbor who's playing music at 2 o'clock in the morning, I know that's suffering. It's a very essential discernment that needs to sit in place. Otherwise, if that discernment doesn't kick in, then we really don't know what to label as wisdom and what to label as a biological reaction and what to label as misunderstanding. So then we don't know how to relate to the different arisings. But I'm surprised at the question in a way, because I would think that discerning the difference between suffering and biological reactions, let's say, is very easy because of a very specific flavor that suffering has, which really just turns life into something uncomfortable. And when it falls away, it's like, that's better. The circumstance hasn't changed. Your friend still did X, Y, and Z, or you still did X, Y, and Z. And one hour you're feeling like really what you did was really a problem. You're really feeling it and it's uncomfortable. Then it fades away. It's like, that's better. And you still, the day before you had still functioned that way. One hour you're feeling really uncomfortable with that, like it's a really fundamental problem. And the next hour, when the energy has faded away, it's like, actually, who cares? And they're chalk and cheese, the two different feelings. Well, one is a feeling of suffering and the other is actually the absence of suffering. They're radically different. So as soon as the suffering comes back in, that would be the flop, going from flip to flop. And then you feel it, here it is again. And life just doesn't feel easy. Or comfortable, rather. Do you want... I don't think he is from the look.
I would like to add just a little, if it's okay. So the way that suffering has kind of cheated me or played tricks on me is by being low on energy. Kind of blame sounds like, whoa, you're really blaming something. And I haven't really felt that I was blaming anybody, because that sounds like, full of energy.
Mm-hmm.
But then what I realized by help from friends is that blame can also be very tiny little thing that you actually kind of almost don't see. But it's still uncomfortable for me and for the other person. And for example, blame, let's take that example. It felt like, in the situation, it felt like me holding up my boundaries. Like, I don't like this. This is not my preference. I would like to communicate to you that this is not something that I want you to do with me when you're my friend, and blah, blah. And I kind of didn't realize that it was suffering because it was so subtle. So I realized it as healthy biological anger, setting boundaries and showing what my preferences are. But by help from others, I found out, oh shit, you're right. I'm actually blaming you. And actually, it's not even important for me. When you show me that it's blame, I realize that actually I'm suffering right now when I do it, and you're suffering, and it's much nicer than when I don't do it. So what felt like a healthy boundary thing just a few minutes ago, now I realize it. Now I can recognize it as suffering, but I couldn't. So that was why I asked, because are there any signs like you can? Can you? Yeah.
Still the best sign I can say is uncomfortableness, and we need to become more and more sensitive to the uncomfortableness, because what you say is very right. Is we find a level of uncomfortableness that we register as uncomfortableness, and that then starts to stop at that intensity, and the new background of our ingrained doership and attachment outcome seems to be normal. So we don't even really register it, like you said, until life then delivers a recognition, hey, this is suffering. And then we become sensitive to that level of suffering where we weren't because it seemed normal. And once we become sensitive to it, then it's non-acceptable and it gets picked up very quickly. And so then that stops happening at that intensity, and there might be an even subtler still that is considered normal. And usually it only becomes apparent once it's been seen to not be normal, but to be seen as a subtle form of suffering. When that suffering energy falls away, so if you are blaming someone, so one of a good sign is that when the energy falls away and you find that actually I don't need to tell you my boundaries, you realize, the telling someone my boundaries is actually a way of validating the suffering, a way of, or it's dictated from within the suffering. And when the energy falls away, it's sort of like, so let's say you ring someone up and say, look, can we meet at 4 o'clock this afternoon? We need to talk about something. And then at 3:45, the suffering energy falls away. And you meet up with them and they go, what's going on? And it just doesn't seem relevant anymore. Whereas in the morning when you rang them up, it's like, I know exactly what I need to tell them. Then the energy changes and it's not relevant anymore. You don't even need to address what they did. And that's a good sign that it's suffering. And it's also another sign that shows us that the circumstance really isn't a problem. It isn't really an attack on who we are. So what they did is not really an attack on what we are, because if it was an attack on what we are, we wouldn't find ourselves at a time when the energy falls away feeling like there's nothing to say. Like I have nothing, I don't have to defend my position because I don't feel attacked. And yet the circumstance still happened, which really means that circumstance was never really an attack on who I am, but it was registered as an attack on who I am when the doership and attachment was at play as an energy in the system.
But I don't understand what you say right now, because it seems like if I understand what you say now correctly, you say that if it falls away later, it was suffering. But natural expressions fall away also. You know, when they're over, it's over. It's not that I'm angry at the rest of my life just because I was angry at that moment, and it was. There's many situations where it's completely natural and totally. It feels so good to be angry, you know, and then it's just over in 2 seconds. So that's over. So saying that just because it disappears, it was suffering. I don't know. Or
no,
did
so
I misunderstand?
So the biological reactions are usually vertical in time. So someone pushes you, you push them back. And that can be biological anger, and afterwards they can come towards you again and you go, listen, it's, you can walk away, no problem. Right? However, if someone pushes you, you push back, and then the situation comes to an end, and you go off and you're thinking about it for the next 3 hours, then that is horizontal in time, and not only thinking about it, but feeling, you know, I really have to tell that person that, you know, that sort of behavior is not acceptable. You're talking to your friends about it. Can you believe this? You know, I was there with some clients and this guy came up and he's pushing me. And so then there's this, that's not anger. That's suffering. And it can also seem like just biological anger, because the circumstance he might have been out of line. So one of the tricks or one of the hints is that the biological anger is usually vertical in time, a few seconds, or really very much linked to the circumstance in the moment. And suffering is horizontal thinking after the event. So if you find yourself with this horizontal thinking after the event has finished, and then you call your friend or this person and say, we need to meet to have a chat, and then that energy falls away just 10 minutes before the meeting, and that was the energy that was present while this horizontal thinking was there, and then it falls away, and then it sort of seems like you'll actually feel, I don't really know what the big deal is. The big deal is contained in the doership energy.
No, but my mind was so smart that it covered suffering within the horizontal, the vertical moment. So you know, so I could think that it was natural anger, but it was really blaming.
Uh-huh.
Do you understand? So I acted upon it right away, like now.
Mm-hmm.
So it feels like natural anger, but then afterwards I realized that, oh, this is actually suffering going on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but thank you.
Yeah. So actually, an interesting point is in what's often encouraged. So this can be a bit tricky. What's encouraged in authentic communication and different methodologies is this openness between partners and between friends, where you communicate your needs and boundaries, and clearly it's there as a methodology because it does solve some problems, because there are, if you look at people in a stage before that, there's, you know, a complete inability to communicate anything, to even acknowledge your own feelings, and a lot of things like that. So that sort of authentic communicating is there and includes techniques and rules and contracts between each other and whatever to address this inability that we tend to have, and to sort of create a space between two people where there's a sort of a cooperation to facilitate that sort of thing, that sort of communication. But at some point, that communication actually can very much become a supporting of suffering, a perpetuating of suffering, where exactly what you said, where we are describing what it is we need from the other, and it's happening within a trusted framework. And so then we believe that because the framework is a trusted framework and it supports this, that this communicating must be all good. Whereas at some point we might find that we need to move past that and not even communicate when it's our suffering, and we realize it's our suffering. That we realize, I don't need the other person to be a particular way. And those strategies, in a way, are to some extent talking about compromise and how can I change you to be more the way that I need you to be, or more like my preferences. And it seems very valid, for there to be compromise in relationship. And the fact is that if we are a particular way and we're not in control, we might want to be able to compromise. We might want to be able to change. But the understanding of non-doership is saying, well, it might be ideal if you change, but the fact is that destiny and life might not have change on the cards. And so this ideal of trying to meet in common ground and compromise, it sounds very ideal, but it may actually at some point become something that prevents us really just accepting that life is going to deliver pleasure and pain through the other and through my own actions. And no matter how clever we become with our strategies, we can't control life. And so sometimes when we start to get down to a really clear understanding about doership and attachment to outcomes, and attachment to outcome is really very interested in finding ways of getting what it wants, we might start to see that these other methodologies served a purpose for a period of time, but now I need to move beyond that.
So this would be a bit of an extension on the topic, because when you say that it surprises you that the difference between suffering and pain, for example, is very clear, and I think that this was a very good example, but there's even more subtle examples where I feel that it's not at all clear, and that you can start refining the layers, and in the top layers suddenly it starts becoming very obvious, which is which, and you can start going down, and then there's a complete world of subtle suffering where it's very hard to determine, is this actually a very subtle attachment to something, or is this actually a biological reaction to life? Mm-hmm. And so take for example that you receive a call that you've just lost all your money. The feeling afterwards, I think very, very rarely will be like, oh shit, and then immediately be like, okay, it's just happened, it's fine now, I'll deal with it, life will bring something else. There will be actually so many feelings that will come afterwards, and many of them are subconsciously, I would think that many of them are subconsciously attached to attachment. There'll be like, oh, what am I going to do now? How am I going to pay my bills? I'm going to be homeless. What about the apartment, etc. So it will take you down a spiral of fear, and that in itself is probably just attachment to money, attachment to security, attachment to comfort. But actually, I wouldn't think that the biological reaction in itself will just be, a very clear and clean, pristine vertical line where you'll just be surprised, and 1 minute later you'll be like, well, that's life. Mm-hmm. I think that it will be all jumbled up. Mm-hmm. And it will be very hard to tell where the attachment ends and the biological reaction begins.
Yes, Actually, when Johannes explained the subtleties, then the line of questioning made sense. Because, of course, until we've become sensitive to the new intensity or the lower intensity suffering, it is going to evade us. So I understand the question, and what you're saying is it's the same in principle. And my experience is that by default so at some point I said, I have become allergic to suffering, was my feeling, is that the sensitivity had so gone down to subtler and subtler levels of suffering, such that when the smallest amount was mixed in, I would feel it. And that usually comes with contrast. So when there's periods of peace of mind where there's no suffering, that is what helps recognize the more subtle layers of suffering. And even our peace of mind, in a way, can become deeper and deeper, because you can have peace of mind that isn't really peace of mind, that has a layer of suffering in it. That doesn't feel like a layer of suffering. So it's only once the peace of mind becomes more actually closer to real peace of mind that we then can see that there was this other layer of suffering that wasn't recognized.
But what about, for example, in this case about the coal, you start shaking, physically shaking. Wouldn't that shaking actually be a reaction to the thought, what am I going to do with my life right now? Like you've just lost, it's not like a life-threatening situation. It's just like you have, everything you had has burned in a fire, sorry. And then you start shaking. Wouldn't that shaking actually potentially be attachment to your properties, or to your money?
It can, obviously it can be, because if we have attachment, then there is going to be when there is a painful situation, attachment is going to grab onto the painful situation and create suffering. But does that mean that there won't be a biological reaction? If attachment has fallen away, does it mean that there isn't going to be a reaction in the body? And the answer is no, the biological reaction will still be there. So the biological reaction might be of a bit of panic because of the situation, the physical situation. So a panic doesn't necessarily imply attachment.
How do you know the difference? Because that's my point, is that it can be so complex to actually see where the panic is coming from.
So at the end of the day, I would say it comes down to the feeling. There's a big difference in a feeling of biological fear versus psychological fear. They have a different flavor. And it's simply a matter of your own discernment between the two. And you will only be able to know, but this is the simple answer, you can only know if you have a discernment. If how can you tell whether something is, which one is red and which one is blue? You need to have an internal discernment about what red looks like and what blue looks like. So if you don't have that internal rule, you just have to guess. Someone says, which one's red and which one's blue? And you go, well, the one on the left is red.
But that's the same answer you would give to somebody who doesn't fundamentally understand this. So I'm talking about something that happens in a level where it's very confusing to actually see, because they look the same and they, in a way, they feel in the end like this type of reactions, they are felt in the body, right? So panic feels like panic. So I understand what you say when you say like, it will be very different, as in there's panic with a lot of thoughts attached to it, like, my life is lost or whatever, so suffering. But what if it's just the panic, being felt in the moment, but it could very easily be in either of both sides of the coin?
Well, what we're talking about is biological reaction versus psychological reaction. Mm-hmm. So if there's panic, but no thoughts of suffering, then the panic is not going to feel the same as if there is thoughts that, my life is over. They just feel different. The thoughts, when the thoughts are present, they have an effect.
What about the subconscious thoughts that could be actually creating that emotion? Like when sometimes like sadness is actually created by a very deep link to a thought that you can't really trace back. You just feel the sadness, let's say. And actually it would be suffering in that case, because it would be linked to that thought. But you can't really trace the thought because it's buried very deep inside there.
Yeah, well, I guess that then it's a matter of waiting for the process to make it so that they are distinguishable. And then once they're distinguishable, that's when that intensity of suffering tends to fade away, and then you're left with the more subtle layer below that will remain unrecognized as suffering until that distinction happens, just like on the layer above. So this whole topic is about feeling and being familiar with and being able to identify suffering as suffering, which should be very easy until you get down to that threshold where suffering and biological reactions are not distinct. But if suffering happens on a level where it is obviously suffering, it should be able to be picked up straight away.
Can I give you another example? Because we were talking with Linda about it at lunch, and like there's, for example, I run, right? And there's so many situations in which you don't feel like going out running, right? And then if you kind of like push through in any way, or you suddenly feel motivated enough to go out, and a moment passes and suddenly you're like, wow, I'm so happy I did this. I still like sometimes question is like, well, where is this motivation coming from? It could actually be because I really enjoy running, or it could actually come from a very deep attachment about this being linked to myself. I'm a runner, like, no, I really like running, and I've somehow convinced myself that I like running to a point where I can't even feel that it's not what I feel like doing. Do you see my point? Because it's very subtle, and actually once I'm out there, I feel like it's something I really enjoy. But I actually don't know where is the attachment. Is the attachment actually in the first part where I actually don't feel like running and I push through? Or is the attachment in the running itself? And you're going to answer to me that I have to feel into it, but actually they feel... it's very hard to tell which is which,
Yeah, well, you can see that there are other forms of suffering that are not hard to tell.
Yeah.
So if there is suffering on that level, and it's unclear, so if a certain form of suffering is there and it's not able to be seen easily or recognized easily, at some point the process will make it so that it is very clearly seen. No different to what Johannes said. Something will happen and it'll be, this is suffering that I've been labeling as a biological reaction, or it's suffering that I wasn't sure whether it was suffering or biological reaction. And at some point there'll just be an insight. This explanation or this dialogue I've been having with my mum, that was presented as a very civil dialogue between me and her over the course of a few weeks or months, may actually have been you trying to get what you want. And it didn't seem like that, because it seemed very civil and everyone was in agreement with that. And at some point it could be, that was just me attached to my mum being a certain way and me trying to change her. So the process, once we become in general familiar with what suffering is in general, guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation, based on doership and attachment to outcome, then that suffering, if it's happening, is not going to go unnoticed forever. Because we're equipped to pick it up. And it's true, we might not pick it up for weeks or months or years. And then one fine day it'll be, that's suffering, and then it stops because there's, a motivation, a reasoning for our energy not to keep pumping into that same behavior.
How do you see this as suffering? I don't understand.
How do you see it as suffering?
It will become evident. So the fact is, there is this dynamic where suffering is unable to be seen because of its either subtlety or because doership and attachment has come in through a back door and we haven't realized that it's taking a particular form. That's what doership and attachment tends to do. It tends to lodge itself in a way where it's not realized to be detrimental to us. It's believed to be beneficial. And all of the pointers are really pointing at the fact that our true nature is peace. Suffering is the opposite of peace. And if we are going to find ourselves connected and knowing ourselves or being ourselves, then these misunderstandings that are in the system need to be seen to be detrimental rather than beneficial. And they remain in the system because the system believes them to be beneficial. And in time, those that actually are detrimental, those behaviors, those beliefs that are detrimental, and there's many layers of the same belief in taking different forms, in play with different people, so the same principle can manifest itself in a particular relationship one way and in another relationship another way. So we might catch out blame in one relationship and it can persist in another relationship because it's taking a slightly different form. But really we're becoming equipped to identify those habits that are really not beneficial for us as being detrimental. That's what the system is essentially doing.
What you were saying is striking to. Okay, it strikes me. Is it here? Can you hear? Okay. In trying to change people, is that suffering?
Yes, that is our attachment to pleasure.
And outcome.
And outcome.
And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And outcome. And
well, outcome is either pleasure or pain, so they're interchangeable. Attachment to outcome really means attachment to pleasure or pain. Really, attachment to pain really means an aversion to pain, which means attachment to outcome.
It reminds me.
Which is doership? Oh yeah, sure, yeah, because it's it's not understanding that actually the person is the way that life has designed them. So at best you say to someone, look, just so you know, I don't really appreciate, you keep bringing me oranges each time you visit, and it sort of unsettles my stomach. I don't eat oranges. So you can give the information out, and then the next time they turn up with oranges again, or they don't turn up with oranges because you've given the information, and then the outcome is not in your control. And we don't tend to accept that, so we keep saying, oh, I don't know, maybe you didn't hear me the other day. I don't like it when you shout at me. And once again, it seems reasonable to describe what we don't like, but at a certain point, we have to learn, I have described what I don't like, and their behavior doesn't change. So that means that I've done what I can to improve the situation, and once I've done what I can, the outcome isn't in my control. So if we keep trying to change them beyond where natural change happens easily, so if you tell someone you don't like oranges, that should be enough. If they're going to change, they're going to change once you've told them. If it's destined for you to keep getting oranges, then you tell them and it's like it doesn't register, or they just can't do otherwise. They say, but oranges are so good, I'm going to give her oranges. There's something wrong with her at the moment, she doesn't like oranges.
Well, I'm asking because it's the situation with my boyfriend who just left me after 3 years, whereby I think we both wanted it to work out, but it just wouldn't. Mm-hmm. And that's it. I kept saying we should do this for it to work out, and he wouldn't do it. And then I thought, but he doesn't want it to work out. But I think he wanted to, but he wasn't equipped to do all that. But why would life do that to us?
Why not?
But until when? Until we die? Or how can we hope? I mean,
find someone better.
And
find someone better suited.
Yeah, better suited.
Why do we have to say goodbye to someone we love and who, seem to love us? Mm-hmm. And how can that flip so quickly? Well,
that unfortunately is the pleasure and pain of the flow of life. So if we say, why do we have to say goodbye to someone we like? And the answer in general terms is because the flow of life is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. So when you find yourself in that situation, it is painful, emotionally painful. And then we might say, well, actually, this is the nature of life. It's not like life is broken down in this moment. And now there's pain which is not part of the nature of life. The description is the nature of life is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. And so we find the breakdown of a relationship, it's painful, it's part of the nature of life. So it's not nice, but it is life.
It doesn't seem to be that bad for everybody. Also, I feel like I'm really, how do you say that? Like ready to fall, like the essence has been taken from me.
As in the pain of the situation.
Yeah.
Right. So when the pain, so what you're feeling may not just be the pain of life. The circumstance that you described of someone leaving, in theory, that is pain, not pleasure. Right? What you're feeling may not just be the pain of life. What you're feeling might be the pain plus the suffering that arises automatically if the doership and attachment to outcome is there. Then when life delivers pain, we're going to feel, one, the pain, and on top of that, the layer of suffering that arises within our system. Now, what is much pain on its own actually is very manageable. Pain in life without suffering is very manageable. It's the extra layer of suffering that feels so uncomfortable. So if I'm getting what you're saying correctly, when you're describing, this feels, it doesn't seem like this is the way for everyone, meaning breakups don't seem to be as uncomfortable as what I'm experiencing. Is that right? That can be very dependent, or one of the variable factors is the suffering. The suffering makes it feel as though it can feel like a complete attack on who I am, and there can be a sense that, actually life isn't worth living. It's like I'm never going to find any fulfillment now, because that which I believe to be my completeness has gone in the other direction. And the good news is that's an imagination that, or a story. It's the suffering. It's a feeling. So it feels very real. It makes life feel very uncomfortable. The good news is that it's not telling you the truth. What that means is that in a year's time, the likelihood is that you would have met someone else and this is many people's experience. They go, wow, I felt like life was completely over and that there was no hope. And here I am a year later about to get married, and I couldn't think of anything more fortuitous than me and my ex-boyfriend breaking up. And yet at the time it felt absolutely like the end of the world. The fact that would be a very realistic commentary to hear from someone is proof that the story that was felt a year before wasn't truth. Because if it was truth, that I am never going to be able to be fulfilled because that which I need for fulfillment, my partner, has gone in that direction. If that was truth, now you've lost half of yourself. So the fact that someone then down the track feels complete at some point down the track is proof that that story is not telling you the truth. So if we can understand that that is one of the hallmarks of suffering, one of the hallmarks of suffering is that it presents itself as absolute truth. The story, the narrative about what the person did and why they shouldn't do it, what I did, why I shouldn't do it, why this outcome, having lost, all your savings and a house in a fire. So all of that narrative tells you what this means about you in a way that feels absolutely authentic and true. If we can register that these feelings of suffering are like a con man that is so convincing, and the con man, we know the con man wears a red blazer, a red jacket. And so the man in the red jacket comes up to us and says, "Hey, I've got a great deal for you." And so you start listening, and it's like, wow, sounds like a fantastic deal. And then you remember he's wearing a red jacket. That's the con man. The trickster, yeah. Like a fraudster. And unless you know that the man in the red jacket is a fraudster, a trickster, a liar, you will believe the story because his story is so convincing. It's only once you get a rule, let's say God comes down and says, red jacket, don't believe them. Doesn't matter how convincing it sounds, it's a lie. Right? That's it. That's the relationship that we can start to have with suffering. Suffering is like the fraudster. It is absolutely convincing. Right? If something inside of us can register a certain feeling as suffering, know it as suffering, and know that it is telling us a lie, that's all. Suffering never tells the truth because it's based on a misunderstanding of who we are. So it never tells us what the situation really means to who I really am. It tells us what it means to the false idea of who I am, which means it's a lie. It's not accurate. It feels terrible. It feels very true. Right? That's the convincing part of it. As we develop and start to see that those energies can fall away if we drop into presence, if we find ourselves dropping into being, which is outside of the thinking mind, and you feel a relief from the suffering, and you feel at peace, and your circumstance hasn't changed, right? Your boyfriend has still decided that it's time to separate. It feels really bad, and yet if the system has developed in such a way that you can drop into being, and for a minute or a few minutes you feel peace, then you've touched into your true essence beyond the suffering. And that true essence is what I started off talking about, that what we are is peace. We've just lost connection to that part of ourselves. So the more that we find ourselves dropping into peace from a place of suffering, the more apparent it becomes that this is an energy that is not the truth, an energy that is essentially lying to us, and that lie permeates our experience and very much affects how we feel about ourselves and how we feel about life. And yet in an instant it can fall away. And when it falls away, it's like, really, it's like, the whole thing clears up. You know, the grey sky suddenly becomes nice bright blue again. And then it's very possible the next moment the grey comes back in again. Right? That's how it tends to work. Until such time as the movement into beingness, which is outside of the thinking mind, becomes a movement that is very well trodden. Right? The pathway into beingness is something that is really happens automatically and quickly and often. And that is part of the returning home, returning to knowing ourself and being connected to ourself. And in that place of being, the suffering is absent. The suffering is not there. So the more that we have this contrast between suffering and back to peace, suffering back to peace, the more evidence we have that the suffering story is essentially a very convincing story that our thinking mind has produced, but it's not it's not a reflection of the truth of what this circumstance means to who I am.
Yes, sometimes when I'm listening to, I can get lost when I'm stuck on a subject, and then the rest can sound like spaghetti. I just lose, the thread of what you're saying, although it's very direct and to the point. And I used to think, why did you always say life is pleasure and pain? And it's not just until now that I've realized that when you say suffering, I'd use that as pain.
Mm-hmm. No, it's not.
Yeah, so I misinterpreted that, because the pain, the suffering is the load you add on in the doership.
Mm-hmm.
Within the pain.
No, on top of the pain.
On top of the pain, on top of the pain, yeah.
Yeah. So I say the flow of life is always either pleasure or pain.
Yeah.
The flow of life, that particular term, flow of life, refers specifically to circumstantial flow of life. So getting the news that your investment has collapsed is part of the flow of life. You get a phone call and there's the information on the phone call, I'm sorry, but the investment has collapsed. That's flow of life, and that's either pleasure or pain. There's no suffering in the information. The information is simply part of the circumstance, and then the circumstance is what the biological, which is the circumstantial part of the entity reacts with, and there's a biological reaction. And the biological reaction could be like something like that. Then the psychological kicks in. Now the psychological isn't part of the flow of life. It's part of your attitude to the flow of life. Now, the attitude to the flow of life is part of life as a whole, because life as a whole includes the flow of life, which is circumstantial, and it includes your attitude to the circumstance. So life as a whole is not just pleasure or pain. Life as a whole is pleasure or pain, plus your attitude to the pleasure or pain, which is either equanimity, peace of mind, or suffering. So life as a whole is the flow of life plus your attitude. The flow of life is just circumstance, and just circumstance means just biological reaction, which is only ever pleasure or pain.
Okay, that's explained it. It's the simple things that sometimes goes over your head, because doership goes so deep that you're listening, but you're only hearing cherry picking or
Sure.
selective hearing, and which pertains to you because you're still the doer.
Well, we're always going to have selective, as in, even when doership falls away, we're still a relative instrument that is going to hear something through our own conditioning, even with doership falling away. So I could misunderstand what someone says, but when the doership is there, it is going to color things very specifically, which means we will hear things. So when I went to see Ramesh's teaching is not that there is no ego. Ramesh's teaching is saying you are the ego, right? Roger is the ego, Ramesh is the ego. And so he says, there is an ego. The question is, Does the ego have the deeply ingrained belief of doership and attachment to outcome, or has that fallen away? A liberated person, let's say, would be an ego where life has dissolved the belief in doership and attachment to outcome. I had come from a teaching that referred to the ego as that which dissolves in liberation. Now, in that other teaching, when it talks about the ego as something that dissolves in liberation, what it's clearly speaking about is doership and attachment to outcomes. Right? So every time Ramesh mentioned the ego, he was saying one thing, and I kept hearing, there is no ego. He wasn't saying there is no ego. He was saying, you are an ego. Ramesh is an ego. Buddha was an ego. Ego with or without the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes. It took me 3 months to realize that that's what he was saying. I just couldn't hear it until and I actually, on my first visit, I wrote a poem or a joke. I modified a joke to include there is no ego as the punchline. So I said it to Ramesh, and I saw Ramesh's face. It was like, and he was about to, explain, and it's like he'd probably been saying it for the last 3 days, and he just sort of didn't say anything. And I remember when it clicked, he's not saying that the ego dissolves, he's saying we are the ego, and what dissolves is the doership and attachment to outcome. And then I remember back to the poem, and I went, oh no, I created this joke, this poem/joke, that completely missed the point of his teaching. And then I got the point of the teaching, and only then did I realize that I had missed the point of the teaching. So, we could be mixing emotional pain with suffering. It's a very easy thing to do. We could be mixing pain in general with suffering. Right? Easy to do until we really hear the distinction. But it's one of the biggest, most important distinctions in the teaching, to understand pleasure and pain as a result of circumstance. So you put your hand under the hot water and it's really hot, that's pain in the moment. You stub your toe, that's pain in the moment. You have a nice strawberry, that's pleasure in the moment. Someone surprises you and says, hey, we're going out for dinner, that's pleasure in the moment. Well, assuming you want to go out to dinner with them. So you can go through everything that happens. It gets cold at night, that's pain in the moment. There's flies, it's pleasure, it's pain in the moment. Dennis cooks fantastic food, pleasure in the moment. Someone, whatever, comes and sits on a chair where it's a chair made for two and the third person squeezes in and you're thinking, really? This is where you decide to sit? Pain in the moment. Nothing, someone can kill someone that you love. Very unfortunate. Like really, I'm not minimizing it, but it fits into this spectrum of either pleasure or pain, because the flow of life is always within the spectrum of pleasure or pain, and it's going to be pleasure if it's in line with your biological preferences, and pain if it's out of line with your biological preferences. So whenever someone smashes your car window, pain in the moment. Someone gives you free tickets to something, pleasure in the moment. The airline ticket you're about to book the day before was $400. You go back to book it the next day, and it was $300. Financial pleasure in the moment. So whatever anyone does to you is received as either, and only ever is, pleasure or pain. Suffering is secondary and based on the attitude that arises in relation to that circumstance, in relation to that biological pleasure or pain. And we can't help what attitude arises, because the attitude is as out of our control as whether a circumstance is pleasurable or painful to us. The circumstance is pleasurable or painful based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning, what we could call the biological aspect of the genes and up-to-date conditioning, and whether the attitude is one of blame or its opposite, equanimity, is also a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning, a specific part of the genes and up-to-date conditioning, which we can call the psychological reaction. So both the biological and the psychological are in principle based on genes and up-to-date conditioning that we have never had any control over. So we are, as a human being, an instrument that is very specifically tuned in each moment. Specifically tuned because there's all sorts of processes that have happened to grow us to this point, and all sorts of influences that we could never replicate a second time round to be exactly the same, that have made us one very specific way in each moment. And in a particular circumstance, we will react or respond or function, behave, whatever word you want to use, only one way. The way that the circumstance and our makeup dictate. And that is the same for our biological and our psychological reaction. So the only reason that we separate them out conceptually is to differentiate that one set of movements, that which we're calling the thinking mind, psychological movement, is what creates the uncomfortable suffering in life. And because it's attitudinal to life, there's, in a way, some sort of, with more control, in a loose way of using the word control, than the control we have over whether it rains or whether what someone else does. So in seeing this difference, we can then start bringing our attention on looking at the attitude, not with the intention of changing it, just with the intention of understanding it and unpicking it, so that it's not this, our life experience is not this big blob of misunderstood stuff, but rather starts to become something that we can understand more clearly by categorizing certain parts of our experience so that it's simply more understandable. And that becoming more familiar with our own internal landscape by default tends to bring about beneficial change.
Okay. Earlier on, I was sitting here with suffering, thinking I should be getting this, I should be knowing it by now. But the understanding is deepening. So, as of before, I would have said I should listen to Roger a bit more carefully. Then I shall not say that, because that would be doership, yes?
Yes, if that's right. If you relax and say, actually, I'll get it when I'm destined to get it.
Yes.
So I can sit back and relax.
Okay, thank you.
Something hit me that you said before about that, because I can feel a lot of peace of mind and stillness, but there's still coming and going subtle suffering together with that, and it's really confusing sometimes. And so, like, the flip-flopping is not so hard. So maybe I ask how I can deepen more. Yeah. be more open. I can feel really much in the stomach. So
you see, the question comes from the suffering that is present now, because in another moment when that energy isn't present, you really wouldn't ask. You would know from your own experience. Actually, it's all been happening, over the last 3 years, 5 years, whatever. Your experience, from your own experience, you'll know it's gone from being this to this. And have you ever known what to do? Have you ever been in control of the process? Have you ever been the one? Yeah, there you go. So I could pretend to tell you what to do, but I have no idea. I just speak, and it's like throwing dice, I speak, and who knows what the outcome's going to be. I just figure that there is an intelligence in each of us that discards all the stuff that comes out that it's not ready to hear, or that is not relevant because it's dealt with that before. And when one piece comes out, that the intelligence goes, that's, and it absorbs that. And then that's like a key. And so if I had to look at, I look at the process as I saw it over a period of 4 or 5 years, or however long it went. And mind you, let me not say, the process is ongoing, it carries on. But there's certain important phases that are heavily linked with suffering. And when I look at it, it feels like there was a combination lock with 1 million numbers. And you had to turn each one in a particular sequence, like a 1 in 300 billion chance of getting it right. And yet, all of the keys were delivered in sequence. Now, either we say that's because there is a big grand plan, and it's already been designed for each bit to be delivered exactly as it is needed. Or you look at it the other way and you say there's this amazing intelligence inside the body that picks up exactly what it needs out of the vastness of each day, where millions of keys are offered each day, and we pick up the one that is needed. And then for the next period of weeks, the key is our intelligence is working on that particular set of insights, and then it clicks into place, and then the system is ready, knowing what it needs next, waiting for a particular circumstance or a particular book to present itself, and then there's a resonance with that, it picks that up.
So more relaxing.
Yes. Our conscious intellect would completely fail at solving this problem, but luckily the intelligence of the body, body-mind, is the same sort of intelligence that developed, the complex brain, the immune system that can deal with foreign entities and fix things. We have a body, cut the arm deeply, and within a few weeks or months, you don't even know you were cut. It fixes itself. I mean, can you imagine having a cut and fixing it? Like without any help of the intelligence of the body? Yeah. So we don't have any idea how to fix the body. I mean, even a doctor, all they do is they get stitches and they hold the skin together and allow the intelligence of the body to actually fix it. So we don't do any of those functionings, and we don't do the seeking and the insights and the understanding.
Was anybody else? I didn't see anybody else.
Oh, Linda wanted before. Yeah.
It's not a burning question. So my question assumes that suffering is diminished or has fallen, for example, in your case, and it's about pleasure and pain. So did you experience, as you suffering fell away, that pleasure and pain, as the attention now probably naturally goes towards pleasure and pain, investigating them, say, with curiosity, that it's not so clear, that the biological conditioning starts to change. The biological conditioning, of course, is preference for pleasure, but that's not so clear anymore what that is. At the extreme, extreme physical pain or so, and maybe extreme pleasure, although I would question that. There's a vast realm in the middle where it becomes muddled. It's not so clear, almost indifferent in a way. It's the third choice. I'm not so sure. Do I like that? What does that mean? Did you experience that? And can you speak to that fuzzifying of pleasure and pain?
So there's the concept in the framework that says we have our biological preferences, and those biological preferences are part of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. So basically part of the human being is what we can call biological preferences. The body, even when attachment to pleasure and pain has fallen away, meaning we no longer feel like my completeness is dependent on circumstance being a certain way, simply because we have found the essence of the human being. We have reconnected to the essence of the human being, which in each moment tells us, I am complete. I don't need to do something throughout the day to feel complete. We wake up feeling complete, and yet the day carries on, meaning the biological entity needs to continue functioning. So when attachment to outcome has fallen away, the biological preferences are still in place, and the biological preferences will always move us towards pleasure and away from pain. But life will not always deliver our preferences. So even though the body is moving towards what it thinks will deliver it pleasure, the outcome is sort of up to life to deliver. But the body isn't going to say, well, the attachment to pleasure and pain is not there anymore, so let me move towards pain. Right? It won't do that. It's wired to do its best to go towards pleasure, but it's not attached to that pleasure being delivered, meaning it knows that even if the pleasure isn't delivered, I am. So this concept of preferences, biological preferences, could be a little misunderstood, where someone says, I can tell you what my biological preferences are. I like ice cream and chocolate cake and,
do you experience where you can't even tell? There's a certain range where you can't tell anymore what's pleasure and pain, where it becomes, I would say, indifferent, although I'm not sure is the
yes.
right word, where just the attention on that, the biological preference cannot tell anymore. It changes or it becomes confused in a way, because pleasure and pain are indistinguishable.
No.
It's clear always what's pleasure and pain for you?
Yes, you have things in the spectrum of pleasure and pain. There can be a big section in the middle that are sort of what you might say are neutral. They're not really neutral, because if you bring in something that is contrasting to that, it becomes very clear that relative to something that is definitely pain, what I was calling neutral is very pleasurable. Right? So the fact is that we always have preferences. So if we say, I am now indifferent to pleasure and pain, it's not really that accurate. And a lot of people will say there is no such thing as pleasure and pain in life, which is part of the falling away of their attachment, but they've got it, it's not quite accurate. What they're really saying is, I'm not attached to pleasure or pain, and therefore I'm indifferent to whether there is pleasure or pain, but they're talking about on the level of self, because they've started to feel, I am, regardless of whether circumstance is pleasurable or painful. And so then the conclusion is, there is no pleasure and pain. But they're saying that relative to how their relationship to pleasure and pain used to be. And what is really changing is the attachment to pleasure or pain. So when someone says to me...
So it's an apparent neutrality, it's not a real neutrality.
Yeah. If they say there is no pleasure or pain because pleasure or pain is based on a psychological movement, I say, well, if you give me your thumb and I get a hammer...
Well, right, at the extreme pain, but I mean, yeah.
Yeah, but you see, but their concept that there's no pleasure or pain because they're not attached to it, and that it's pleasure or pain is just a psychological creation. So if I don't label anything as pleasure or pain, is the logic in that thinking. If I don't label anything as pleasure or pain, then there is no pleasure or pain. And that's where I say, okay, give me your thumb.
Oh no, I didn't mean there's no pleasure or pain. I meant a...
No, I know, I'm just addressing the topic, though. So if I say, give me your thumb, and I hit it, there is a biological sensation. Now, you don't need to label that as pleasure or pain for the biological to receive it as not what it likes. There'll be biological trauma will get put in place if you continue to be exposed to pleasure or pain, whether you label it or not. So these nuances are quite important. So even the more subtle, so that's an extreme example of pain, if you hit someone's thumb with a hammer, but it shows that regardless of whether we feel defined by pleasure or pain, the actual physical or biological pleasure or pain continues to be there based on your biological preferences. So you can, with no attachment to pleasure or pain, if what you get served at a restaurant is really quite ordinary, a very ordinary meal, the expectation and the blame isn't going to arise. But biologically, there should be able to be a discernment in the system that wasn't, the same standard of meal that this restaurant normally provides. So that's why when your question is, do I find it confusing to distinguish?
Confusing was a bad word. More of that the range of things that are, for example, you like strawberry ice cream, and you like strawberry ice cream for 20 years, and while suffering was going on, and now suffering has stopped, and the attention goes to strawberry ice cream as you're eating strawberry ice cream and realize, I'm not so sure I like it, it's just a sensation at this point. So that's what I mean, things that were clearly biologic, or they felt like a biological preference, because they're minor. I'm not talking about somebody smashing your finger or extreme pleasure. Just things that were labeled in the range of pleasure, they become anodyne in a way, and vice versa. Maybe something that was painful, it's not so bad anymore. So there's this range in the middle that.
So there is a specific change, but I think it fits into a different category to the original question, is that if you were, let's say, going out in the evenings when there was attachment to outcomes, because you believe that going out in the evening was going to deliver potentially your happiness, because you might meet your soulmate or whatever it was. When attachment to outcome falls away, and there is a contentment with oneself, and then you're not looking for external circumstances, you might realize that you have no motivation to go out till 3 o'clock in the morning anymore. And then you will look back and realize, wow, when I was going out to 3 o'clock in the morning, I thought that was because I enjoyed it. But actually it was because it was a situation that gave me hope that I would find completeness or happiness in that activity. So a whole range of activities that previously you engaged in can fall away because they no longer make sense.
Yeah, so more in the psychological pleasure and pain range where that gets clarified.
Yeah. So the equanimity or the indifference that I would agree is there is on the level of feeling defined by pleasure or pain. But so if I say I'm not attached to my arm, because I understand that my arm being there delivers pleasure, a convenience, functionality. And if I lost my arm, I would feel as complete on a level of self as when my arm was there. And so if someone said, well, in that case, let me chop your arm off, I'd say, no, thank you very much. I'm very, very happy to have my arm. It's a bonus. So non-attachment doesn't mean I'm indifferent on a biological level. I'm very much grateful for the fact that I'm not being tortured, very much grateful for the fact that I have functionality of my arm. And yet, if through circumstance of life out of my control, something happened to my arm and it wasn't functional, we don't know for sure how we are going to react and feel, but based on the pattern that has been put in place where things have been taken away, I would feel confident in saying that I wouldn't feel defined on the level of self by the fact that my arm wasn't there. And so hopefully that gives an idea of where the equanimity or indifference lies, and it's on this attitudinal or psychological level and not on the biological level. Yes, we can make this the last. Yeah.
So the teachings so far have been sort of based on the fact that awareness is falling on the person.
That awareness?
The awareness is falling on the person, which is very valid and very helpful. But then there are teachings which say that the I, and you mentioned it as well, that everything in the present moment is the I. So whatever's, the five senses basically, what you touch, see, hear, smell, and taste. And then there are the teachings which say nothing ever happened. There's no birth, there's no death. And then you have the teachings which say, well, you are the ego, but without a sense of doership.
Mm-hmm.
So you're talking about the lock, the numbers sending the lock, and it's all a sequence.
Mm-hmm.
Is it, or in reality, is it all happening in once, or is it a sequence?
So when a teaching says there is no causality, there is only this, there is no process in seeking, there is, well, let's just stick to that, that's the most pertinent thing. There is no process. So there are a lot of teachings that say this idea that it is a process that happens in time is in itself part of the misunderstanding.
The process itself is, sorry, could you say that again?
The belief that there is a process in time that happens is part of the misunderstanding. Now, the reason why that approach is taken is because unless a teaching is going to go through and create a framework that points at the specifics of suffering and what suffering is based on, which means quite a lot of detail and nuances and all of that. And those details and nuances are not necessarily the most effective way of bringing about change. Sometimes detail and nuances actually just overwhelms someone's mind, and what is much more effective is just a very broad statement about something. So unless a teaching goes into the nuances of suffering, what needs to happen is an undermining of the suffering process. And the suffering process is very much based on the belief in causality, or not really a belief in causality in general, but if you look at blame, it's you did this, and as a result of you doing this, then this happened, and then this happened. And so the whole narrative of suffering is dependent on time and dependent on independent entities that affect something different from itself, which is our ingrained belief of separateness, which means doership. And so instead of going into all of those details, a teaching can just say there is no causality. Undermining one of the principles on which the suffering narrative rests. To me, if we then look at life as it unfolds, it's not really truth that there is no causality. There is, on one level, there very much is causality, even for the liberated person who, let's say, no longer has ignorance. Causality still continues to be the way life unfolds. So if that's the case, it means causality isn't a result of ignorance. It isn't a result of seeing things incorrectly. Because if it was, it would mean that once someone sees things clearly, causality stops functioning. If causality continues to function after life is seen clearly, then it means causality is not a result of the misunderstanding. It's independent of the misunderstanding. So Buddha and many other liberated teachers put forward teachings that by default are causal. Otherwise they wouldn't say anything. So why does a teacher say anything? Because they know causality actually is the mechanism by which change happens. Otherwise there's no point in saying anything. So even a teaching that says this is not a teaching because there is no teacher and there is no student and there is no time, is actually a teaching being delivered that is looking to bring about causal change. And part of that teaching is to say that causality doesn't exist. So all of this is really basically saying that teachings are methodologies, and they identify a particular part of the problem, and because there's lots of different forms of suffering, some based on being attached to outcomes, some being based on doership, and then many different forms under each of those different headings. There are many different treatments, in a sense, for each of those dysfunctions, if you want to call them that. That's why one teaching can seem to have a lot of contradictory components to it. And if a teaching doesn't within it have contradicting components because the teaching decides to just focus on one of the problems, one of the dysfunctions, when you look at another teaching that is dealing with another of the dysfunctions, it uses a different technique or a different treatment. And then you compare the two and you say, well, that teaching is saying there's nothing to do. And this teaching is saying you're the one that has to make the effort. So you scratch your head and go, so which one's telling me the truth? Instead of us realizing, oh, they're teachings. None of them are truth. No teaching is the truth. Any teaching is a concept. Whatever is said, whatever is written down is a concept. So what you are as consciousness is a concept. Nothing ever happened is a concept. It's not the truth. It can be accurate from a certain angle describing, and it can be useful, more importantly, useful to undermine a certain form of suffering. At some point, all teachings say, hey, you have to forget about the teaching. Once you've used the boat to get across the river, don't carry the boat around on your back. If you see Buddha on the road, kill him. Kill Buddha, what do you mean? Buddha has delivered liberation. It's an indicator, it's saying Buddha is just the teaching. You have to drop the teaching. Ramana says, use this thorn to undo the thorn that is embedded in your thumb, to unpick the thorn that's embedded in your thumb. So this thorn is referring to a spiritual concept. The thorn embedded in the thumb refers to a concept that has turned into a belief, such as the belief I am exclusively the body. And so Nisargadatta would put forward the spiritual concept that says, you are not the body. And so Ramana says, use that concept, you are not the body, to uproot the deeply ingrained belief, I am just the body. But then be sure to throw both thorns away. And what tends to happen as part of the seeking process is that this thorn, I am not the body, uproots the belief I am the body, and inevitably it gets embedded in the thumb, which is why Ramana says, hey, be sure to throw both thorns away. Not because he thinks you can throw both thorns away, but because he knows that at some point you'll realize that this thorn, which was a spiritual concept, has actually replaced the previously ingrained concept. So before we thought, I am only the body. And then for a while we run around saying, I am not the body, I am consciousness. Because that teaching has got embedded in our thumb. And when it gets thrown away, then we have no use for either of those concepts. I'm not sure if I addressed the question.
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
Because it's some investigation. So, teachings of Robert Adams say, where do your thoughts come from? Whereas some teachings say, so what is the source of the I? So what is the source of this? What is the source of this room, the sky, the people in here, my body, everything? So, I guess you've got to, whatever feels right, to, these thoughts come, so you think, I guess there's nothing that's right or wrong. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
There isn't. There's a whole range of concepts that need to be delivered at certain times to deal with certain issues, and a teaching is a methodology, and what sometimes we don't appreciate is that you can have one problem and two very different methodologies that are both very appropriate for solving that one problem. And this misunderstanding about teachings and thinking that they're truth is why people compare teachings and can't hold a great range of teachings as valid. Because they think, well, the teaching is truth, and therefore you can't have one saying one thing and the other. So we have Advaita that says there is the consciousness of the one consciousness of Source, and certain schools of Buddhism that say it's personal consciousness, not an impersonal consciousness of Source. And then there's arguments between the two schools which one it is, and they're just a concept. It's not the truth. They're a concept there to undo I mean, the whole methodology of Advaita, for example, is designed and says, okay, what is the problem? How do I address the problem? And so there's a methodology of Advaita gets put into place. Zen Buddhism sees the same problem and says, how do I fix this problem? And they put in place a methodology that shares some common bits, and then some other bits are not common. But that the Zen methodology obviously worked for some Zen masters, and the Advaita methodology worked for the Advaita masters. They, in my opinion, have the same freedom. The path and the insights that came about to bring about that same freedom may well have been very different, and they will see their freedom through the lens of the teaching that delivered their change. So, appreciating teachings as teachings at some point is a great liberation for the seeker. And furthermore, these thorns that get embedded in our thumb, which are the spiritual seeking, like any belief, has so much power that they can actually create the sense, create our experience, such that it has certain characteristics to it, certain characteristics that match the concept, like you are not the body. And because that's the case, it can be very hard for us to see the concept as not truth, because the experience has changed, and then we see, well, that concept is exactly like the experience, so it is truth. What if the concept is actually influencing the experience? We look at it the other way around, and because the teachings say there is ignorance, and at some point there will be the revelation of truth, of reality. What if what we call the revelation of reality is actually influenced by the spiritual teaching concept? And yet, on another level, we're not relating to it as a relative experience. We're saying, oh, now I know truth, reality. And therefore, the concept that may actually be influencing the experience goes unseen for a long time, because it's assumed that because my experience has changed in line with what the teaching is describing, that now I know truth, and so I'm not holding any beliefs. Whereas in fact it could be the other way around. The belief is set in place and it's influencing the experience such that it feels like there's no person, for example, which is more prone to happen in certain teachings because of the specifics of the concept. So each teaching has its pitfalls. Each teaching has its dangers in a sense, but it has to be like that, because teaching can't, it has to be pointed, which means it has to be emphatic about some things in order to bring about change. And then it says, well, once that change has happened, if there's any collateral damage, we'll deal with that then. But first we need to bring about that important change.
Thank you.
Tomorrow? Unless it's short.